Welcome everybody to our regular monthly Center for Popular Music Brown Bag Lunch event. I think most of you know me, but let me introduce myself in case you don't. I'm Greg Reish, I'm director here at the Center for Popular Music, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Arthur Banton of the MTSU History Department, who is going to speak with us today about a topic that is hot, shall we say, and I notice he wore his purple shirt and tie appropriately. We've got more purple in the audience, which I'm sure is not by accident. So with no further ado, help me to welcome Dr. Arthur Banton.
Prince Rogers Nelson. All right, his work was extremely impactful, and the reason why I am here today, his entire discography is the soundtrack of my life. All right. This presentation is from an essay of the same name, and hopefully it'll be published in 2018 in an anthology on the impact of Prince's life and music and the Minneapolis sound, which he cultivated so much, cultivated and inspired. So why analysis of When Doves Cry? Well, there's a few points I want to cover. First, I want to provide some sort of context to the year When Doves Cry came out in 1984. And how other genres of music impacted When Doves Cry and Prince, provide an analysis of the song, the chorus and the two verses. I also want to provide an overview about the music and the cadence of the song itself. I also want to engage this whole notion of queering masculinity and of course come to a sort of conclusion, all right? But sort of give you a frame as to what I'll be talking about. If it's okay, I'll just read the abstract. In May 1984, Prince released the single, When Doves Cry, from the soundtrack to the film Purple Rain. It was not only the biggest selling song of his career, it was also his first record to reach the top of the pop charts, but even more curiously, to the top of the rhythm and blues, otherwise known as R&B charts. When Doves Cry reflected the complexity of relationships and urban black masculinity in popular culture that was being defined by diverging images from popular music and the pre-mainstream consumption of hip-hop, known back then as rap. In New York City, where this sort of hyper-masculine identity is cultivated in some respects, a necessity for survival in economically disadvantaged communities, When Doves Cry challenged that narrative with its riveting, hypnotic, cadence of synthesized drums and seductive guitar riffs that seem to hypnotize listeners before chanting a chorus that appeared to serve as a question to one's identity, self-worth, and trajectory. This song resonated with young black men, though they probably wouldn't admit it. Here was a performer who wore makeup, a pompadour, and strutted on stage in heels with a guitar, but he was also in the company of attractive women, and that was the paradox. It was in this context of his flamboyant and feminized masculinity that granted Prince, a cool pass, and allowed us to justify his acceptance while reconciling our own uncertainties. When Doves Cry, with its depth of emotions, was a mixtape in itself and a soundtrack for many young black boys who were searching for an identity that could fit into our complex environments. This presentation intersperses personal anecdotes and analysis of the song in an effort to deconstruct what I contend is one of Prince's most personal and revealing songs ever. So that's a little abstract. All right, first a little bit about me. As a historian and a cultural theorist, my perspective is drawn from not only being raised in some of these environments to which I'm speaking about, specifically in East New York, Brooklyn, but also as an admirer of Prince and a DJ who used to actually create these mixtapes. As a result, this essay is interspersed with personal reflections that provide some semblance to the cultural impact of this song. Personal songs from Prince. When Doves Cry. I know some of them probably take you back a little bit for some of you who remember this song and when it first came out. All right, but what I want to do is focus on some of the most important facts of the song and why I'm doing this presentation. Right, this is obviously from the soundtrack Purple Rain, which came out in 1984. It was very, very successful, exceeded expectations, grossing more than $70 million, and there was a lot of challenges actually making the film. All right? But the song itself was released May 16th, 1984 from the soundtrack Purple Rain. It reached number 1 on the Hot 100 singles chart on July 7th, 1984. It spent 5 weeks at number 1, and this data is all from Billboard magazine, which is the industry magazine, the record recording industry magazine that was providing this data. But most importantly, this song went to number 1 on the R&B singles chart for 8 weeks. 8 weeks at number 1. Is by far his most successful song, particularly a song that resonated with folks in the black community. Prince is only the second artist and song to simultaneously reach number 1 on Billboard's R&B, dance, and Hot 100 charts. Only the second artist to do so. I think some of you might know who the other artist is.
Who was it?
Michael.
Of course.
All right. This was the biggest selling song of 1984, selling more than 1 million copies. And according to Rolling Stone magazine, of its 500 greatest songs, they ranked it at number 52, greatest song of all time, and it is the most successful commercial recording of Prince's career. However, I would also take it a step further that it is the most personal song of Prince's career, and that is why I'm talking about this today. But first, let me take a step back and to provide some sort of context to what was going on. All right, 1984 was a turning point for rap. In only 5 years since Rapper's Delight, the first commercially successful song, the first commercially successful recorded rap single roared across the airwaves, the presence of albums, once a rarity, were now starting to appear with regularity, and the genre seemed to be finally getting off the ground. It seemed like the genre was finally getting some respect, and after being labeled by critics as a fad. That year, Run DMC's self-titled debut album was released in March. In October, Houdini released Escape, the most commercially successful rap album to reach the top 40. Also that year, there was not one, but 2 movies, Beat Street and Breaking, which highlighted the physical, impulsive, but syncopated artistic movements of breakdancing. Finally, one of the earliest collaborations between rap music and its more established cousin, rhythm and blues, arrived in October that year with I Feel For You, a song written by Prince and performed by Shaka Khan, which featured the guest rap vocals of Grandmaster Melly Mel. In the midst of rap transitioning from a 12-inch single-driven genre to one being defined by albums, was a song that seemed to come out of nowhere, engulf the airwaves while breaking chart records with an unorthodox formula in its musical arrangement. Enter When Doves Cry. Recorded and performed by Prince Rogers Nelson, known to the world as Prince, When Doves Cry was a single from the soundtrack of the motion picture Purple Rain. It might seem a little odd, applying an anecdote featuring a narrative of rap music to address the most commercially successful song by Prince in terms of chart position and radio airplay on Billboard's black music charts, but When Doves Cry arrived at a moment when rap was establishing itself as a platform for artistic expression by countless numbers of young men whose voices were lost, if not outright silenced, against the backdrop of communities ravaged by the effects of post-industrialism, which deeply impacted amorous relationships. There is an artistic sonic connection between rap and When Doves Cry, in which Prince was experimenting with the use of drum machines that were quickly becoming a staple in rap music by producers who wanted to provide a backdrop of sounds and hard-edged drum rhythms to complement the narratives of storytellers. As musicologist Griffin M. Woodworth notes, quote, rap music used the very technique that Prince explored, funk rhythms in stripped-down settings. This may in part explain why he had such a profoundly ambivalent relationship with the newly ascendant music form, end quote. which some disc jockeys aptly recognize. When Doves Cry is worthy of a holistic examination because of its accomplishments, it was also the biggest hit of Prince's career, both in chart position, record sales, and in some respects, cultural impact. The reception by the black community can only be measured partly through radio airplay and retail sales, which underscore the crux of this essay. The song also accomplished several feats that impacted the trajectory of black music by challenging conventional compartmentalization of music that is largely informed by race and racial identity. When Doves Cry is notable because its commercial success extended into music video where it demonstrated an expansion and redefinition of black masculinity to a generation of young men born during the post-civil rights era. In addition to a point addressed earlier, the connection to rap is significant because the song resonated with young black men who grew up in urban environments, who was reluctant to embrace Prince, whose understanding of masculinity was reinforced through rap music. But when Doves Cry, a song not easily compartmentalized into a single genre, challenged those perceptions by striking a chord of emotions whom for some were deeply buried into our subconsciousness. What is undoubtedly clear is that Prince was an artistic chameleon who could carve a space and firmly situate himself in it, even though he aesthetically and sonically did not appear to fit. This further demonstrates why he is one of the most highly praised and respected recording artists of all time. As countless numbers of ethnomusicologists, cultural anthropologists, historians, sociologists, and critics have noted, black music is a direct correlation of black life. These songs are indeed a creative expression, but usually in response to a social and economic condition that is so ubiquitous and central in the urban black experience. The success of When Doves Cry was remarkable in its ability to appeal to different audiences in a variety of ways. Its musical composition was simplistic, but ingenious for its artistic approach. Prince's stripped-down funk, which includes the removal of the song's bass lines, was, according to Woodworth, quote, a minimalist masterpiece, end quote. The catchy chorus was also a significant factor, but one should not discount the relatability of the lyrics, which rounded out the song's appeal. Complemented by the film, the song provided introspects into Prince's personal life while providing a window to the artistic interpretation of the challenges facing amorous relationships in post-industrial urban black communities. Prince, who was signed at 18, was given creative freedom by his record company, Warner Brothers, by entrusting him to produce his first 2 albums, in which he played all the instruments and made all the song arrangements. What you heard in his music was an extension of his persona and not just fodder for publicity or some concoction influenced by some marketing virtuoso. Prince rarely interacted with the media because he felt the attention of journalists would be drawn to him and his unfamiliar eccentricities as opposed to the music. In other words, he did not want to be a distraction from his art for the simple reason that fans may not embrace the music solely on its merits. Prince didn't need to make a statement through the press. His music and stages which he performed were his mouthpiece. With his untimely passing, we may never know what truly inspired him or what his creative process entailed. But one thing we do know about him, if you paid attention to his music and embraced it in its context, you will realize that he was unforgivably true to himself and his art. Prince Rogers Nelson was undeniably Prince. When Doves Cry is not an autonomous pop song, as it is often suggested. The lyrical narrative born out of storytelling which goes to the heart of the blues tradition. As Albert Murray notes in Stomping the Blues, quotes, blues lyrics address themselves directly to the negative economic, political, and judiciary circumstances. Far more often than not, the main emphasis is likely to be placed on the victim's love life, end quote. Rhythm and blues extends that narrative into a sonic setting that is more upbeat, appeals to urban tastes, and reflective of the contemporary problems that afflict everyday African-American lives. Farrah Griffin underscores this blues narrative, but specifically applies this to urban blues and subsequently R&B, a genre in which Prince's music is partially grounded. Quote, "The blues provides an excellent metaphor for what happens to the migrants when they arrive in the city. In terms of content, blues lyrics focus on the impact of a city on the migrant. However, the form of blues, the development of urban and city blues, and their subsequent impact on the forms of American music suggests that the migrants impacted upon the city as much as it impacted them." End quote. And When Doves Cry, the lyrics of the song reflect a number of polyphonic narratives that converge at the nexus of love, longing, and finding one's identity. The chorus, which has become to define and advance the popularity of the song, reads, "How can you just leave me standing, alone in the world so cold?" You can all hum to the chorus. "Maybe I'm just too demanding. Maybe I'm just like my father, too bold. Maybe you're just like my mother. She's never satisfied. Why do we scream at each other? This is what it sounds like when doves cry." In the larger context of the song, Prince appears to be addressing the dissolution of an amorous relationship with his significant other. But a deeper analysis reflects not only a relationship gone wrong, but one that enables him to reflect on the continuity with his parents and his own identity through their personality traits and narratives. The post-civil rights, post-industrialization of America had a huge toll on working class African-American relationships, to the point where dysfunction was becoming synonymous with a reality that was increasingly and dangerously perceived as the norm. Working class families, who are more likely to endure economic hardships, are more susceptible to solving conflict through violent means. The narrative depicted in the music video and in the semi-autobiographical film Purple Rain, the parents of the kid, portrayed by Prince, get into a physical altercation to the point where the father has to be restrained by the son. This scene, synchronized to the lyrics of the song, crystallized an image and narrative that is all too familiar in post-industrial working-class households. When Doves Cry introduced Prince to a generation of fans who were willing to embrace an artist and a form of artistry that was unapologetically masculine and genuine. The first verse illustrates his conformity to the heteronormative sexual behavior, while also enveloping a passion that is both erotic and romantic. Dig, if you will, the picture of you and I engaged in a kiss. The sweat of your body covers me. Can you, my darling, can you picture this? Dream, if you can, a courtyard, and oceans of violets in bloom. Animals strike curious poses. They feel the heat between me and you. The subtle demonstration of sex in a setting that impresses a vision that is aesthetically striking, set in a natural, unrestricted habitat, is part of the allure that calls upon the listener to conjure up a vision of an ideal environment where lovemaking is not inhibited, but encouraged. For Prince, this is a space without walls or unnatural boundaries. The demonstration of masculinity is unquestionably romantic, but also exhibited in a space away from his past and present domicile, which represents an environment not hospitable to a natural progression of courting, romance, and copulation. His personal narrative, and perhaps hers, is one filled with strife. The relationship of his parents and their demonstration of love went against the grain of what he considered normative. In the song, he tries to recreate an ideal vision of normal for him, which in turn inspires other young men to reflect on their relationships or conjure up an image where they could demonstrate their feelings without the constraints of walls. And in the case of many young inner city men, those walls are not just physical, but also psychological. The expectations of conformity to a hyper-masculine narrative means not embracing or denying the existence of romance in idyllic, rustic settings. In Rolling Stone magazine, Prince disclosed his reluctance to promote his music to the media because he wanted journalists to focus on his music as opposed to the relationship with his parents. He noted, quote, "I used to tease journalists early on because I wanted them to concentrate on the music and not so much me coming from a broken home. I really didn't think that was important," end quote. When Doves Cry, inspired by the film Purple Rain, was both fact and exaggerated circumstances by the film's director and co-writer Al Mignoli. Prince noted, quote, "We used parts of my past and my present to make the story pop more, but it was a story," end quote. However, the song might have been inspired by a deeper, more complex anecdote. In regard to the present state of his parents' relationship, Prince noted, quote, "My parents live close by each other, but they don't talk," end quote. For the protagonists in the song, Prince, or others from similar situations, the teens or early adult years can be a time of self-reflection as to why their own amorous relationships failed to meet their expectation. A factor could be the result of internal anger toward the parent not present in the home, or a reflection of a desired demonstration of love and affection by the parents to each other. In this case, Prince is questioning his identity and openly wonders if he is subconsciously assuming the persona and behavior of his father, brought to the surface by his girlfriend's constant and shifting demands throughout the progression of their relationship. The protagonist wonders if one's personal identity is preordained along with his behavior and the trajectory of his present relationship, which is also demonstrated in the music video, is constantly brewed with conflict that leads to not a compromise, but instead toward a path of destruction that could entail with violence. A point depicted in the film. The song becomes more reflective to the reality facing a number of African-American amorous relationships when Prince admits the instability of his home life, particularly the discord with his father as a teenager, impacted his own relationship with women. He noted, quote, "Poverty makes people angry, brings out their worst side. I was very, very bitter when I was young. I was insecure and I attacked anybody. I couldn't keep a girlfriend for 2 weeks. We argue about anything," end quote. Sadly, part of the success of When Doves Cry can not only be attributed to the relatability of the song and its relationship to the personal narrative of the artist, but the lyrics, which reflect a profound spiritual connection with the symbolic meaning of the dove. Historically, a religious artifact rooted in Christianity, the dove, generally bearing an olive branch, as you see here, is supposed to bear the symbol of peace, victory, and chastity. More explicitly, in Christian antiquity, quote, "the dove appears as a symbol and as a Eucharistic vessel." A figure well known in deeply religious and spiritual African-American communities. And When Doves Cry, as its title suggests, Prince cast himself and his significant other as the religious and spiritual symbolic meaning of peace and innocence, whose natural romantic impulses are suddenly and unexplainably interrupted by a poltergeist that forces him to evaluate the situation, his identity, and the behavior of his lover. As non-conventional households increased for African-American children, so did the creative production which became crystallized in When Doves Cry for its unconventional music, cadence, and mouthpiece. One could be led to think that Prince seemed most likely to connect with urban black youth, but in reality, he was raised in this space. Though he grew up in North Minneapolis, it had its share of mean streets. Sandwiched between Interstate 94 and Highway 55 and Theodore Wirth Park, his old neighborhood seems sufficiently contained from the rest of the city to the south. West of his North Minneapolis neighborhood was Lake Minnetonka, a locale praised in this film Purple Rain as a site of escapism, which might in reality have served in that capacity as a place for him as depicted in the film. The second verse continues the narrative implied earlier, except that it seems to preclude the actions in the first. Touch, if you will, my stomach. Feel how it trembles inside. You've got the butterflies all tied up. Don't make me chase you. Even doves have pride. At first glance, the opening verse implies a recollection of memorable romantic encounters, whereas the second one noted above constitutes explicit actions informed by the first. In other words, it seems like the two verses should be actually inverted. However, a deeper analysis suggests the romantic narrative to which Prince follows and is exposed to does not follow the conventional trajectory of society's rules for courting, even though he desires in some capacity to replicate what is articulated as normal. This further suggests that dysfunctional home does have some bearing on Prince and those from other similar household arrangements as to how they view, articulate their feelings, and practice amorous relationships. The second verse also articulates that his appetite is fueled by a desire for a romantic interlude which is unmistakably erotic, innocent, and organic. If the butterflies represent what is medically described as, quote, an anxiety-induced by stress, then the tying of the butterfly suggests that her presence and all that entails reverses his anxiety while also fueling his passion. In other words, he is not shy when it comes to demonstrating his feelings for her. His innocence is shed when it comes to his desire for her, which is organic and reverent, but also sensitive to the pains at the thought of rejection. But the passage also suggests that he dissuades the idea of challenging his innocence and this celestial, by his perception, moment to which they are situated, because such actions would be the antithesis to what is natural and occurs by chance and therefore may lose its appeal. The subtext of the verse also interjects spirituality into what could potentially be a romantic encounter. He also suggests that fate should not be feared. Follow your heart and your ego. And to follow your heart and your ego. To reject the feelings is to resist what is natural. To resist what is natural is inorganic, is not real, and may not be love, but senseless pride operating under the guise of the aforementioned prognosis. Processing the underlying meaning and translating to the culture of hypermasculinity was not very difficult. Very few, if any, young men wishes to be rejected by a woman he so desires. The pride suggested in the verse is ego, a powerful force in a hypermasculine directive whose salvation is articulated by, don't make me chase you. Prince takes the machinations of romance very seriously, and When Doves Cry demonstrates a cunning attempt to direct the listener into the subconsciousness of their soul and find that innocence that drives the emotions of romance uncorrupted by an unreconciled past. One can only wonder what inspired Prince to draw up the musical arrangements for When Doves Cry, whose success in black radio is striking for the fact that it lacks a bass line that is so omnipresent on songs popularized on black radio. As Nelson George, former black music editor for Billboard, notes, the song, quote, the song lacks that seemingly fundamental instrumentation relying on a heavy tom-tom sound for much of the bottom, end quote. An artist whose earlier hits were rooted in the spirit of disco and funk was considered, an artist whose earliest hits were rooted in the spirit of disco and funk, in which the bass line was significant, if not essential, and its removal from When Doves Cry was considered blasphemy to the fundamental core of soul music. Yet his decision to remove it was ingenious, and it resonated with young urban African Americans. The absence of that bass line did not undermine the soul of the song. Even its funky electric guitar intro was prophetic to those like myself who love the funk sound. but was increasingly being drawn to the beats and sounds of rap. When Doves Cry combined elements of hip-hop and dance with this consistent syncopated drum beat that fits seamlessly into the early stages of rap when it was still trying to establish itself as a permanent genre while fighting the commercial impulses that could undermine its edginess, while simultaneously legitimizing and marketing itself to the masses. Now, the final point I want to make is in reference to masculinity, the masculinity that Prince exhibited. Musicians have always donned attire that reflects their creativity, identity, and sense of style. However, in the post-industrialist America, these couture narratives have challenged sexual norms and what was deemed acceptable as gender-appropriate attire. Queer, a term with multiple definitions, is widely applied to gender-related behavior that falls outside of society's expectations and is often touted as bizarre, strange, and unusual. It was in the space of urban Black America that cultivated hypermasculinity as an antithesis to queer. And by 1984, this mode of masculinity now had a distinct, powerful, emerging voice in the form of rap music. There was a paradox regarding Prince and his articulation of masculinity. His attire, bikini underwear, spandex leggings, and high-heel boots, along with his high-pitched voice and mannerisms, challenged many conventional forms of what was deemed as normative masculine behavior. But despite his queerness among my peers, he was considered not quite cool, but a response reflective of his half-acceptance to his brand of masculinity. Hypermasculinity bore out of a heteronormative narrative is also connected to African-American urban definition in which Marlene Kim Connor addresses as street cool. The examination of cool begins, quotes, on the streets of this country because that is where the desperate need for a code of manhood originated. Street cool is the stage of cool that is angry, daring, and impulsive. It is also the mode of cool that deals the most in style and symbol, end quote. She adds, quote, your cool must be conveyed first through your appearance, next through your attitude, and finally through your ability to defend yourself, end quote. Prince did not amply fit into Connor's definition of street cool, but he certainly challenged various components which comprise that definition. According to the aforementioned definition, Prince was certainly queer, or what Mark Anthony Neal calls an illegible masculinity, a term that evokes its definition from the aesthetic performance of Black masculinity. Neal notes, quote, illegible Black male bodies, those Black male bodies we can't believe are real, quote, are in fact determined by mainstream perceptions of Black masculinity. So legible is the opposite of mainstream perceptions of masculinity to which Prince Rogers Nelson fits, even though he demonstrates aesthetically the opposite. His exuberant flamboyance articulated through his attire in the music video, fluttered blouse, heels, pompadour, etc., ran in opposition to the overly sexualized demonstration of heteronormative behavior. But his intentions were to challenge the status quo in a rebellious way that is unfamiliar to my interpretation of masculinity. His illegibility was also about showmanship and impressing his female admirers. Sentiments echoed by his contemporaries who adopted similar looks. As Prince once noted, quote, I wear heels because women like them, end quote. Prince demonstrated to young Black men that we didn't have to accept the condition of our parents' narrative if we chose not to. Our masculine identity was not predetermined by our environment. We determined our own trajectory, and for some of us that meant constantly daydreaming and desiring for a new norm against barriers that constantly suggest otherwise. This is why the Doves Cry. In conclusion, When Doves Cry was probably one of the most introspective songs Prince has ever recorded. Even more so in the context of the film and music video, it seems so personal but simultaneously so relatable. It deals with a young man who is trying to come to grips with his past so that he can draw up a plan on how to move forward. Prince was known not to deal with the media, but instead allowed his music to speak for him and then move on. Perhaps that is what fueled his motivation to work at a kinetic pace to where he was able to release 13 albums in as many years. I argue it was more about exhuming pent-up creative energy and a fueled desire to embellish a discourse with the world, and based on his discography of 39 albums, he apparently had a lot to say. When Doves Cry extended the narrative, challenging what is considered normative in numerous ways. Here was a song whose musical composition defied the parameters of what the establishment considered a formula for success, because his artistic narrative operated in unfamiliar ways. He was musically dissimilar because he was psychologically free from the gender expectation norms of his inner city Minneapolis community. The song was unbound but relatable, one that can confront perceptions of masculinity without necessarily threatening its existence. When Doves Cry enabled many young men to reflect on their personal narratives in a way very few songs could. Reaching #1 on the charts in various music genres demonstrate its popularity across conventional categories. The song was part ballad, part dance, but all reflective. The song was also part R&B, part rock and roll, part dance, and part hip hop. It crossed genre lines because it was never designed to seamlessly fit into one. That would be very un-Prince-like. Prince was woke because he had a greater sense of self and didn't mind letting us know. And to him, I am thankful. Thank you.